Hello and welcome to episode 6 of the Situational Awareness Matters radio show. I'm your host, Rich Gassaway. The purpose of this show is to improve situational awareness and decision-making for individuals and teams who work in high-stress, high-consequence environments. Our mission is simple, to help you see the bad things coming in time to prevent bad outcomes. In this episode, we'll talk briefly about the myth of multitasking. And then we're going to listen to an interview I recorded with wildland firefighting safety officer with 40 years experience on the line. In that interview, he'll talk about how important it is to develop a mindset of a just culture in the wildland firefighting community, why a culture of compliance won't work, how age brought wisdom to him and helped him realize the need for instant gratification was far less important than the goal of bringing everyone home in one piece. He'll share his views on fire shelters and their limitations and why he says he wouldn't carry one unless he was forced to, and why he thinks a fire shelter is a political piece of equipment. He'll share with you his close call survivor story on the Salmon River and how situational awareness barriers of task fixation and tunnel vision put him in a tight spot that, reflecting back, left him with a margin of less than 5 minutes between life and death. He'll tell you how a feeling of urgency saved his life. This is what I refer to in the Mental Management of Emergencies classes as intuition. Amazingly, as he was going through hell, he stopped and took pictures, literally. And he'll discuss with you the challenges of the Yarnell fire investigation. This interview takes about 50 minutes, but you won't want to miss it. Stick around. He's an interesting guy with some really smart things to share. If a picture is worth 1,000 words, a live demonstration may be worth 10,000 words. In a recent situational awareness and decision-making class, I explained to the participants the science behind why humans are such poor multitaskers. Of course, when I do this, there's always someone in the class who, for whatever reason, thinks they're great at multitasking. I love it when this happens because I'm prepared. I set up an exercise where 2 people get to role play being in charge of an emergency. One of them is going to multitask. Guess which one has the dubious honor? And the other one gets to perform only a single task. The multitasking person has to perform the same activities as the single-tasking person and one additional physical activity. The results are always predictable: a train wreck. Because the first task is not particularly difficult, the single-tasking person's performance is always nearly flawless, while the performance of the multitasking participant always turns into a disaster. The multitasker forgets about 90% of the data they were supposed to remember, and their performance is fraught with errors. It's sad and unfortunate. The simple fact is, the conscious human brain cannot multitask the act of paying attention. Plain and simple. This is backed by science and the analysis using functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI data. Responders can be lulled into believing they're good multitaskers because they do it so often with so little consequence that it gives them the confidence to think that they're good at it, where in reality they're not good at it, and luck is the only thing standing between them and disaster. Concede to the vulnerabilities of the human brain. Acknowledge that multitasking is a myth and avoid it by focusing on performing one critical task at a time. Proper staffing plays a big role in the efforts to avoid multitasking. Preloading an incident with the proper number of responders will reduce the exposure and the need to perform multiple concurrent tasks. Here are some discussion questions you can share with your coworkers. Why do you think people think they're good multitaskers, when in fact their brain cannot multitask at all? What can first responders do to avoid multitasking during high-stress, high-consequence operational periods? Describe how your situational awareness has been impacted by multitasking. I was recently in Hella, Montana, and I had the opportunity to sit down with Wayne Williams, the safety officer for the Montana Department of Natural Resources and Conservation, to interview him about his position ensuring the safety of wildland firefighters. Let's listen in to this interesting and sometimes provocative interview. Tell me a little bit about your background and how it was that you became the safety officer.
Well, I guess you'd start back. I graduated from high school in 1974. Really didn't want to go to college, and had always been interested in wildland firefighting. Specifically, I really wanted to become a smoke jumper. So I had heard about these crews that were working on the west side of the Sierra Nevadas, and they were made up of conscientious objectors to the Vietnam War who were doing their alternative service by fighting forest fires for 2 years instead of going to Vietnam. And I was not a conscientious objector or known as a CO, but they were running out of these guys because 74, the war was almost finished for the United States. So they had openings, and so I applied for one of these openings and basically started working on a crew at age 18 with people from all over the United States who came from various religious backgrounds like Mennonites and Quakers, really strong work ethic. I can say without a doubt that was the hardest I probably ever worked in my life. But that's where I got my start, and then after that, I did that for 14 months in Northern California, and then after that, I applied for the U.S. Forest Service because that was a state-sponsored crew, ironically, by Governor Ronald Reagan, and so I applied for some U.S. Forest Service jobs. Got a job on the El Dorado National Forest in 1975, worked there for 2 years, and then applied to all the jumping schools. Eventually got accepted in Missoula in 1977. And I would work there in Missoula, going all over the United States, but based out of Missoula for 33 years.
Wow.
And then I retired and then went to work for the Montana Department of Natural Resources.
Okay, and then were you hired in as the safety officer into the DNR?
I was, and that's a good question because the position had not officially existed outside of a temporary position before I applied. So this would be the very first full-time employee that they would put into the position. So it was all new territory for me, and that's one of the reasons why I applied for the job, because I was interested in starting a new program.
Mm-hmm. Now, what are your duties?
Well, the main thing, my main duty, of course, is to look out for the well-being of the line firefighter. It's not that I'm not concerned about the other overhead that are involved in wildland firefighting, but where the tire hits the road is the guy on the line. So that's where I spend most of my time trying to mitigate safety for those individuals.
Okay, and what are some of the things that you have done to try to improve the safety of the line firefighter? How long have you been in the position that you're in now?
About 4 years.
Okay, all right. We would establish that, and if it was like 4 months, I'd be like, well, I'm just kind of new at it. So in the last 4 years, what are some of the areas that you have focused on that have caused you concern that you say, these are the areas that we need to be improving on, and what maybe some of the things that you guys are focused on?
Well, first of all, I didn't go at it like these are dangerous things or these are things we have to improve. I went at it I need to establish environment where people are comfortable talking to me about safety issues. That's the very first thing. So the very first thing that I felt had to be established was what I refer to as a just culture, where if the majority of us, when we get up in the morning, we don't think that we're going to be involved in some sort of a unsafe act, or that we're going to cause injury to ourselves or to others, right?
Right.
And so when you approach it that way, the key is that you want people to realize that they haven't done something wrong if they ended up getting in an accident, or they ended up having a act that would hurt somebody else. Because if they're willing to talk to me about those unfortunate situations, then all of us as a group can learn from those, and we can pass it down for year in and year out. So again, the first thing I wanted to do was to have that culture where people were comfortable about talking to me about safety.
Were you, when you first came in, did you sense that the just culture wasn't quite there yet, as far as people just being comfortable and opening up and saying, hey, I didn't mean for this to happen, but here's what I did, and here's how it happened? Have you had some hurdles to get over in creating that environment?
Not necessarily. I think you have to look at it from a different point of view. You have to not look at it like there was a problem. You have to look at it like all of the wildland firefighting organizations have always traditionally done business a certain way when it's come to safety. And most of that is driven by compliance. Now, I've been around long enough, over 40 years now in fire, that I know compliance is a failed state. Compliance is helpful, but it is not a way to run a safety program. You can't just jam this stuff down people's throats. So the new way of looking at it is that if we have this openness, this culture where people can learn from these mistakes, then we're really going to be benefiting those people. And if we just simply go by compliance, you're wearing the wrong kind of boot, or your sleeves aren't rolled down, or whatever, that doesn't really get you anywhere. And if you go all the way over and you look at like an entity like OSHA as an example, OSHA is always looking for root cause. I'm a strong believer that there is root cause sometimes in an accident, but sometimes there isn't. There is not always root cause. You can not always find out what happened. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times, because the individual might be dead, or whatever the circumstances are, you don't have enough information or evidence that you can decisively say this is what happened. And I think it's foolhardy for safety people to think they can always come to a conclusion to this is why. So it's better to look at it as, how can I keep this from happening again? Because going back to the beginning of our conversation, we were talking about people don't start the day thinking they're going to cause harm to themselves or to other people. And particularly in wildland firefighting or in structure firefighting, that's not the way we do business. But we're in a dangerous occupation. So if you're in a dangerous occupation, accidents and fatalities are going to happen. You can't prevent those. I think it's foolhardy for a safety person to say, we have to work towards zero fatalities, zero accidents. Because we're not in an occupation that in my opinion, is realistic. But we can certainly work towards a safer environment, a safer culture, and so that's why I took this approach.
Yeah, it's what you're referencing is Decker's work and his book.
I've read a lot of Decker's
just
stuff,
culture,
yeah.
and I don't know that the people who do the investigations, at least on the structural side, are quite to where they embrace this idea of a just culture and learning. We're still very consequence based over in our world. Somebody has to have time off. Somebody has to lose their job. There has to be a fine. And OSHA's really focused on let's penalize them. But what have we learned? For when somebody has to pay a big fine, versus as you say, how do we keep it from happening again and put the focus on the fix and not so much what caused it with blame, but to try to figure out how to learn from it and keep it from happening again. What you're going to be giving a presentation here at the meeting. Kind of give our listeners, since they won't be here, a flavor of the message that you're going to be sharing with these hand crew folks? I know your PowerPoint isn't right here in front of you, but just in general, what kind of message are you going to be instilling along to these young men and women that are going to be going out on the line this summer?
Well, I think the main thing is just to be to be open about what are the actual issues that could possibly cause an unsafe situation for them. So there's many of them out there in wildland firefighting, just like they are in structures. And some are foreseen and some aren't, right? So the ones that are out there right now, and this is more of a general state of the United States because of the baby boomers retiring. My biggest fear is that there's a lot of inexperience out there now. Now, I'm not talking about a new person starting. I'm talking about the structure of how we learn our trade. So when I started in 1974, I started where there was a few new people starting, what I refer to as a huge middle class of experienced people, and then a very small group retiring. Okay, so what that allowed for me to do is have this long honeymoon of gaining experience. That's the way I kind of put it. So I started, and I had several different mentors going through this process. And when I finally popped out and was now in leadership on the fire line, I had gained many insights into wildland firefighting safety in leadership from many different people. But on top of that, I aged a little. And that's not a bad thing either, because I think as you get older, you realize what your ultimate goal is to bring everybody home in one piece. Because when you're younger, you want, I think we all want more instant gratification. I save that structure. That feels really good. But when you're older, it's kind of like, I don't really give a shit about the structure. I give a shit about all you guys coming home. Yeah. That structure can be built again.
Yeah.
It would be nice if the homeowner said, hey, thanks for saving my house. I really appreciate it. But when you get older, you realize, would that homeowner even live in that house if someone died trying to protect it?
Yeah.
Maybe not. So that's just one example. So in general, I try to tell these people there's an inexperience deficit out there, and that they need to be cognizant of that. They need to know that it's out there. So if someone comes up to them and says, I want you to go down there and cut fire line, I want you to think twice, because that person may be talking like they know what they're talking about, but they may not be. Yeah. So you have to be careful. Now, I'm not specifically talking about another DNRC employee telling someone to go down. In wildland firefighting, it's an interagency show. So they may end up going to a different state, work for a different agency. That's where it's more of an unknown factor. I know that the DNRC is pretty solid with their experience, and they're very thoughtful about how they bring their people through the system. Certainly, it's not perfect, but I think that the DNRC is a little bit more healthier because it's a smaller organization than some of the other wildland firefighting organizations that are much bigger. Because the famous saying is, we can stop the train and turn it around if we want to, because we're a small group. But on the other hand, we've also have not had as many tragedies in our ranks either. So that's one of my greatest fears. We've never had anybody ever die in a wildland fire that was a DNRC employee. That hasn't happened yet. Yeah. And of course, you being in safety and myself, we know that it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. Yeah. You can't avoid that. And so I think about that. But anyhow, back to the PowerPoint. Those two things are what I worry about, what I try to tell them. But I also try to tell them about some of the equipment out there, like, for example, the fire shelter. The fire shelter is a very limited tool. And what's interesting about it is that the fire shelter was invented by the Australians. The Australians don't use it anymore. The Canadians don't use it. There are certain places within the United States, like the tundra of the interior of Alaska, where a fire shelter would not work. So for you to carry it around is foolish. You're carrying around 5 pounds of nothing. And so the fire shelter does have some areas where it might protect you. But they need to know the limitations of that piece of safety equipment, because far too many people, in my opinion, have died in fire shelters. And so that's one of my talking points is...
Do you think the shelter, for some, give them a false sense of confidence that if I get into a spot, well, I've got the shelter, and I'll just deploy it and it'll all be okay? Do you think there's some out there that shelter is like I hate to be cliche, but like a safety blanket that they think that might give them latitude?
I think if we look at it from a whole interagency wildland firefighting community, I could say yes. I don't know if I'd say that about the DNRC, again, because we're a smaller organization, so the information can get out there quickly. But when you look at statistics of fire shelters, and I started fighting fire before a fire shelter was mandatory. So it's not even part of my DNA. I would not carry a fire shelter, not unless I was forced to carry it, because I never had to carry them before. When I started, we didn't even have fire pants. All we had were fire shirts. That was the only piece of wildland firefighting clothing we had to wear outside of hard hats and gloves and boots. We wore jeans. And so the fire shelter was never part of my DNA. It was never something that I ever trusted. And to this day, I still don't trust it. And in general, I have seen people dead in fire shelters. So I have to ask the question, where are all those statistics? So the people who manage the fire shelter is Missoula Technology and Development. And the statistics that I see is how many people have been saved by fire shelters. But I want to see how many people have deployed fire shelters and didn't need them, because I know that's happened. I've experienced that firsthand. Not me deploying it, but seeing people who've deployed them and didn't really need them. I want to know how many people have died in fire shelters. And then the other thing about the fire shelter is the academic side of it. So the other day I was talking about the fire shelter and about its limits, and this fire scientist came up to me and he says, well, you really shouldn't be saying that. So this fire scientist was telling me that if you properly clear around the fire shelter, if you use them the way they're intended, that you should be able to handle higher temperatures. And so I looked at him and I said, it's not like the fire shelter is the same in a burn chamber or in an experiment than it is when the tire hits the road.
Yeah.
So as an example, what I tried to explain to him was, you're not going to get a situation in most cases where flame is not going to be touching the shelter. If someone deploys it, it's probably too late anyhow. They're probably on borrowed time. In my opinion, they're on borrowed time. Yeah. But what that means is, and I talked about this earlier today, is that flame lengths on fires like Yarnell and South Canyon and a lot of those larger famous fires that we've lost a lot of people can be between 100 and 200 feet long. And that is not straight in the air, that's laying flat. So it's literally 100 to 200 feet that you'd literally have to pass through. The shelter would have to pass through that flame length. And that's where the issue is with the shelter. That's why on those fires where you have 2,000 degrees, there's just not a chance in hell. In fact, not even half of that, there's probably not much of a chance. And the other thing that I didn't mention earlier when we were talking is that when I started, the fire shelter wasn't really a part of our equipment. I think I mentioned it was a fire shirt. That was it.
Yeah.
So for me, I've never even thought of it as anything but extra weight and just some political piece of equipment. Uh-huh. And so you were asking me earlier about if there was anything where I felt that I was in danger. How close did I push it?
Yeah.
Well, obviously I'm here talking to you, so I didn't push it.
Push it far. And I don't see any scars on your body, so
no. So I didn't push it far enough to where I had to crawl into a fire shelter, even close. But years ago, it was I want to say it was like my second or third year as a squad leader. So I was a young leader. It was in the early 90s, I think it was 92 or 93, somewhere there. And I was on the Salmon River, which is notorious, very, very steep, brush, grass, spotty timber. And what I remember most about it, because in a sense it was kind of humorous, there were two fires going on, one on either side of the river. We caught our fire, but on the other side of the river, this other crew of jumpers had lost their fire, and we're kind of going, we got ours, they lost theirs.
Were you taunting them publicly or just to yourselves?
Well, they couldn't hear us.
Okay.
We're talking thousands and thousands of feet across the canyon.
Okay. Were you throwing rocks at them, or
we couldn't hit them with a rock.
Okay. Hey.
But it was just kind of a funny thing, but what we didn't understand is the wind had hit there first. And that was coming our way. And all of a sudden, the wind hit our fire, and we lost it too. So the fire went for broke. So what I decided to do, I decided there was one flank that we could maintain, and it would also maintain an area of safety for us. And I just referred to it as the west flank. And I started getting retardant drops on that flank, and I started hitting that flank really hard. And I had the crew keep supporting that line. At least we'd hold off that west flank. And the main reason, there was a cabin, not of heavy value, but where someone lived, that was about a little less than a mile away. So by creating that flank, it would also hopefully give us some breathing room if we were thinking about protecting that structure. And luckily that structure was down in the flats, surrounded by grass, so it would have been very easy to protect. There weren't any big fuel pockets near the structure itself. So the crew went ahead and they just kept reinforcing and digging more and more of that west flank, and we kept taking it longer and longer. We had everything else gone, and so the fire was just going for broke. So eventually it was obvious. I was up on a ridge, sort of separated from the crew, calling in the retardant drops, talking to air attack. The crew calls me back and they said, we're better off going down to the cabin in that flat ground, because it was a bench. So it was real steep, then this beautiful bench, about 100 acres of grass. That's where the cabin was. And then it dropped back down again, steep. So they said, we're better off going down there and making a stand at that cabin, because we can just burn out the grass, do it at our own speed, and then we'll have a place to hunker until this fire gives us another opportunity to fight it. And I said, okay, that's sound advice. I like it. I said, okay, great. Well, what I'll do is I'll start picking my way from this ridge vantage point I'm at back to where you guys are. They said, okay, sounds good. So they're down there and they're burning off in this cabin and they're setting it up nicely. And basically, they had done a great job. So I'm walking down this ridge, and I hit their fire line, and I started following the fire line, and I could see the cabin through the trees. And then I get a call from them, and they go, hey, you know what? We had to leave some of our stuff up there, and can you swing by our old campsite and grab some stuff? And I said, yeah, sure. So I started following the fire line down, and then eventually it petered out. That's where they bailed and went down to the cabin. So I kept staying on the ridge instead of bailing, and I got to where our gear was. Much like that video that you showed today about Eric Hipke having that feeling.
Yeah.
That was the only time in my career I had that feeling so I'm collecting this stuff.
Hold on.
Sure.
What was the feeling?
It was a feeling of urgency.
Okay.
All of a sudden I felt like, what am I doing collecting a bunch of stuff? I need to get the hell out of here. But I wasn't at that conclusion at first, and the reason why is because I'm a guy who likes to get the job done. Yeah. My job was to dig through these packs and try to get as much shit as I could for everybody, and then head down the hill to the cabin.
And like you said, I think in your presentation, you're not the kind of person who likes to leave your shit behind either.
I don't.
Yeah, right.
Don't.
So, and there's their stuff, so you're gonna help them out.
Right. And then I'm getting the thing that changed my whole mind. I was starting to get that feeling of urgency. It just was coming up, and then I get a radio call where they said, "Well, can you get this?" And they're kind of asking for more stuff. Now it was all doable, but I'd have to stop, kind of rearrange my pack, shove shit in there.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, I looked and I said, "The hell with this!" And I started running down the hill, full sprint. And
did you have the stuff with you?
No,
you left it behind. Okay,
I did hang on to my stuff,
but not theirs.
Yeah, and the reason why is that they had at least what I had on my back. This was just some more like sleeping bags, I guess.
Yeah.
And so I started heading down, and I wanted my tool. And I started running down this hill, and these spot fires were popping up all around me, and I felt like this running back dodging defenders, trying to get to the goal. And the goal was down in that meadow that they'd burned out. And I could see it. And I'm running at spot fire here, then it's like big spot fire here, and I had to get around that. And then big spot fire coming towards the bigger spot fire. And I snuck through that, and I just kept going, finally get down to the bottom, and I pop out by this big, I remembered, it was just this big ponderosa pine, a beautiful tree, and because I just remember that I felt like this sense of shade, and it felt good because I've been dodging this stuff, and it was starting to get kind of dusk too. So the fires were very brilliant. I remember that they're very, very brilliant, and these spot fires that were just popping up like crazy. And literally, someone would have watched me. They would have gone, "That guy's out of his mind. He's just zigzagging all over the." But I was. So anyhow, I get down to the cabin, and then they had done a wonderful job of setting it up for us to be the place that we were going to hunker. And so we basically burned out that area. We got the cabin pretty well settled, and the owner left. He jumped in his truck and left while he could. And I'm glad he did that because he was just an old miner, and he just threw his best guns and his best liquor in the rig and left. Yeah, that's pretty much it. And he said, "We were welcome to whatever we could find." That's what he said. And off he went. So we stayed there, and we got we spent the night, and it was fun. It was totally safe. There was water there, and the fire burned around us. It burned completely around us because we'd burned out this football field. And then what became the bigger danger were rattlesnakes. Because the fire had chased these rattlesnakes out of one area, and they were coming towards us because it was a good deal. Yeah, it was where it was cool. It was kind of a funny thing, but one of the guys on my crew, he was from Raggate, Montana, and he was just this kind of really wood skill individual, and he very meticulously caught these snakes and moved them away from us. And he used sticks, and he did a really good job. He was using a headlamp, and he moved them away. It was just almost dark now. It was probably pushing 8:30, 9 o'clock, just about where you start getting dark. And he had meticulously moved these, and he came back, and I said, "Why won't they come back to us?" And he goes, "Oh, because they're in a safe place over there too. They're not going to come to us." He goes, "Think about it. It was either us or dying. Now it's like, oh, we're beyond them. We're good." And he was putting himself in the mind of these snakes.
Yeah, like a snake charmer.
Yeah, I just thought, God, that's great. And he was right. Those snakes never bugged us the rest of the day, or the night, I should say. And so the next morning, I was just really curious. I wanted to go up to where I'd made my decision to get the hell out of there. So some people, I had to leave relatively early in the morning because some people, now the fire that we were on, instead of it being 5 acres, was now 10,000. And they were assembling a Type 1 team and everything else. Well, one of the ops guys, who was a good friend of mine, had called on the radio and said, "Hey, I want to come down and see what you guys are doing, so I have an idea." I said, "Fine." And he says, "Well, I'll try to get down there early afternoon." So that's when I took off at about 8:30 in the morning and hiked up there, because now the fire was way up where these people were. The incident management team were now having to manage it. It had left us pretty good. And I get up there, and basically the backpacks, the clothing, everything is burnt beyond recognition. It was like a a moonscape. These nice ponderosa pines and some brush and other things that were there, they were gone. It was a done deal. And so anyhow, I kind of thought, yeah, I'm glad I made that decision, and I probably should have made it sooner. That's what I told myself. I was getting too oriented to help these guys out, and in the process, I pushed it. But I made it. And so I just always told myself I needed to pay attention from here on out and not worry about stuff.
Yeah.
And get the hell out of there. Interestingly enough, I did stop, and I'd forgotten about this. I stopped and took photographs of the fire before I started running.
On your way down.
Yeah. And so anyhow, I showed him to a fire behavior guy, and he said, he goes, you can tell that fire was ready to blow. He just says, but these are great shots. And
when he looked at the photographs and saw that it was ready to blow, did you know when you were shooting the photographs?
Probably. Maybe that was one of the things that told me to get the hell out of there. It's hard to say. You know, you were talking in your talk today, like what is it that makes you think it's time to go?
Yeah.
And it's all different for everybody. Right?
Yeah.
And a lot of times, we talked earlier today that there's a lot of things that will never know. So to think about it too much, you're almost. But I would like to think that what I took away from it is the most valuable, and that is don't screw around in the future. And when you get that feeling, just leave. And don't take pictures. Don't put your pack back on. Don't try to grab stuff for people. Just get out of there.
Yeah.
And ironically enough, I would have dreams about that point. And they weren't like nightmares, but they were dreams about me up there. And I'd have them over and over again for like about a month, you know, and they were almost continuous, sort of, where the dream would leave off, and then a couple days later, I might start dreaming about the same subject again, and it might catch up to where I was. It was just kind of interesting. So I remember I talked to a friend of mine who has analyzed a lot of dreams. She's actually a professor of exercise physiology, but for some reason she has this interest in dreams. So I talked to her about it, and she said it could simply just be that it was like this time in your life that meant something. And so that's why your mind kept playing the tape over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
And there were a couple other times throughout my career where I had some, what I refer to as the down and out fire, where you know the fire's taking off on you, and you run to one of the flanks and make the down and out. You know, and I've had a couple of those happen over the years, but none of them were as close as that one situation.
Now, as you went back up the next day and looked around, and then later looked at the pictures, how much time do you think? How much time did you?
That's a good question.
How much time did you have? Do you think, now that you've reflected back on it? In other words, at some point you knew you should go. You stayed. You were still packing packs. Got more urgent. Finally, you said, "Heck of it, I'm going." If you would have waited around, continued packing stuff, how much time do you think you'd have had before it would have been no return for you?
Well, certainly, if I would have waited 5 minutes, I would be dead. There's no question in my mind. But almost maybe if I would have waited an extra 2.5 minutes.
So it's pretty tight.
Well, the thing that was interesting, I wouldn't say it was seconds, but it was definitely minutes, because when I was running down through the spot fires that were erupting and getting larger and harder to maneuver through, a minute later I may not have had that opening, and I would have been surrounded.
Did the guys in the clearing know the spot you were in?
They're clueless.
No?
I had no idea. And I never even said anything to them, because it was sort of like, I'm here, I'm not dead, I couldn't get your shit, sorry. And I said, what the hell, you know. And the thing was we had a good deal. We were on this flat country. We had enough gear to stay warm. The guy had food and water in his cabin that he offered to us, and some other things. And so he, we were set there, and eventually that ops guy did come down, and he just kind of said, well, you guys are pretty much done here. Do you want to come up to the fire camp, and we'll assign you guys in overhead positions?
you know, and I talked to the crew and they said, yeah, let's go up there.
At what point did you realize how close you'd come? Is it when you went back up the next day?
Yeah, I think that's when I started putting it together, and then I started thinking, okay, now what was it like? What were the steps I took? And so I think the first step is that I started just packing stuff, and then the second step was I got another radio call to pack more stuff, and then the third step was I don't really have time for this shit. And then the fourth step was, God, that's pretty interesting fire behavior, and I snapped a couple pictures. But you have to realize that I used to carry a Rolly 35 camera, which is about the size of a fat wallet, and it was a 35 millimeter, took great pictures, made in Germany, was a favorite of wildland firefighting because it was so compact. And I used to carry that in a pocket that was right on the strap of my line gear. So I could just pop it out like within a second or less. And that's what I did. And I just remember took a couple of shots and then off I went.
When you had the pictures developed and then the guy looked at them and said how close it was, did you see in the pictures something you didn't see in real life?
I just thought they looked cool, to be honest with you.
Okay.
And the whole thing is, I've never been a big... I don't think that somebody who is a fire behavior analyst will always give me the right information anyhow. This guy probably gave me the right information with the knowledge that he had. But the thing is that I don't bank on... Over the years, I never had... when I started fighting fire, we didn't have the luxury of a spot weather forecast. We didn't have the luxury of radio sometimes. We didn't have the luxury of a fuels technician or the luxury of fire behavior analyst. We didn't have any of that stuff. So you always had to depend on your own stuff. So when I hear from those guys, and I think it's valuable information, like I said in my talk, you have to take it with a grain of salt nonetheless. It's information you need to process. But the key is to be here now, to be curious, to pay attention to what's going on in front of you right now. And back to the situation awareness, being aware of the fact that you can only think of one thing at once. So as you rotate around to the subject matter that you're paying attention to, and you're categorizing that subject matter, this is how my brain works. I don't even know how other people think, but in that situation, the very first thing I remember I was thinking about was, I'm bummed out that I lost the fire. And then the second situation was, well, why think about that now? You lost it, so you can throw that away. Now the second, okay, now I got to get the stuff for these guys. Now I'm starting to notice that the fire's kind of getting up and going. Now I'm looking over the edge, and I don't really see a lot of leeway. I didn't feel I had to go back to those other subject matters because they were sort of old news.
Yeah.
And so that's the key about you put things in your mind in this order that you understand. And a lot of times you'll go back to them because they're still relevant. But sometimes they're not, and you got to get rid of them. You got to throw them away. You got to delete them. And I think a lot of people get in trouble because they won't dump that shit. They won't get rid of it.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't know, but that for my personal experience, what I used to always tell people when I wanted to give them advice about something, I used to just tell them two things. I used to say, pay attention to what's going on around you. I didn't use the term situational awareness.
Yeah, that term didn't exist in the early days.
It didn't.
Yeah.
Pay attention to what's going on around you and be a good communicator. Because you could be the smartest guy in the world and understand what's going on, but if you're not communicating that to your people, they're screwed.
Yeah, right.
And that was something that I noticed over the years, is that sometimes the hardest worker is not always the best leader because they don't have good communication skills. And we as an organization, we want to reward those people who've worked hard, physically worked hard in the wildland firefighting business. But if they don't have those communication skills, then they'll do themselves in their crew I'm trying to think of the right term.
An injustice?
Injustice,
yeah.
right. That's true.
Yeah.
Just like I couldn't remember
What was it? I can't.
I don't remember, but it was funny.
Oh yeah, it was trigger points.
Trigger points. Yeah.
And here's why I can't remember trigger points. Because trigger points happened way after I started. We never used to say trigger points. We'd say things like this. Well, that fire's up and gone. We're getting the hell out of here. It wasn't like, as soon as it hits that tree that has kind of the red on the top, then I'm leaving. It was like, that fire's moving. We're leaving.
We're leaving.
And that's what's interesting about trigger points is that they make people pick stuff to say when it hits that, it's good. Then they start thinking about that.
Yeah.
They start thinking about that tree, and they start thinking, well, it hasn't hit that tree yet. But what is the fire doing before it hits the tree?
Yeah.
If it's moving, get the hell out of there.
Yeah. Could be by the time it hits that tree, it's all she wrote anyhow. Yeah.
And what's really interesting, when I talk with people about the Yarnell fire, the investigation, I totally understand. You had two investigations. We talked about it earlier. We had the compliance-driven OSHA investigation from Arizona OSHA. They have a funny name, but nonetheless, it's the state OSHA entity. And then we had it from the interagency wildland firefighting community. And the interagency wildland firefighting community wanted to take that approach of a just culture, like we were talking about earlier, and about learning from this. And I think that's really good. But on the other hand, there are certain things in the Yarnell thing, and I brought it up today. The monsoonal flow, for instance, it's clockwork. For you not to think that there's going to be wildfire behavior when the monsoons have set up, because you will have wildfire behavior, or rain, or both, or lightning, until the sun goes down. So why weren't they thinking about that? To me, it's sort of like, I need to put my seatbelt on before I move this vehicle. It's an elementary thing when it comes to fighting fire in the Southwest. So that was one thing. The other thing was, if it's more efficient to move on a trail, why wouldn't you?
Let me, before you move to the moving on the trail, do you think, and we'll never know because they're all gone.
Right.
So, you talked about that. There's things we'll never know. But do you think they, if we had to take this down two paths, one, they didn't think about the monsoonal conditions, or two, they thought about them, but ignored the fact that it would happen. Do you think, which direction do you think, speculating,
I would say it could be one way or the other.
Yeah.
But again, we got to go back to that inexperience deficit that I was talking about.
Yeah.
So you think about it, that was a young crew. The majority of that crew, their experience was 1 to 2 years, maybe 3.
Yeah.
And there were 3 fairly experienced people. But let me tell you, my 20th year, I almost killed a crew. I was really experienced. I'd been all over the United States. I had not just experience, but I had geographic experience. But I still almost killed a crew. And finally, ironically enough, I was looking through the lens of the camera again. I realized that I was making a mistake. And I told the crew, we need to get out of here. And I remember what was funny. I was in New Mexico, ironically, and it was during the monsoonal flow, and it was, but it wasn't the monsoons because we jumped at night, not night, but we jumped at sunset. So literally, nightfall was upon us pretty quickly. And when we got down to the fire, it was about 10 acres, and we started cutting fire line around it, and it was on top of a ridge, and it slopped over on both sides. So although we were cutting line downhill, we weren't going like way down to a canyon. So we're kind of going around, and I got out in front. There were just 6 of us. We were the last guys left in town, basically. And as I got sort of out in front and circled around, I started getting that bias for action, or action for bias, however you want to put it.
Yeah.
I wanted to catch this thing.
Yeah.
So I came back down around, and I started noticing some kind of fire behavior. And we're about mid-slope. I started noticing this fire behavior, and it was burning an alligator juniper. An alligator juniper is just really tough juniper down in New Mexico. It's just a tough son of a bitch, and it is really hard to burn. When I saw that thing go up in flames, I said, I got some fire behavior here that I wasn't expecting. And so then I started thinking, oh shit, there's an inversion here. There's an inversion. I'm mid-slope. I hiked down from the jump spot, mid-slope, There's an inversion, and that's why it's so damn hot. I was sweating, and it was like 10 p.m. And so that's when I realized this is a bad place for us to be. And there were a pile of rocks that I had walked over, and I realized that'd be a safer place. So I went down. I told the chainsaw guy to cut the saw, so he did. And I said, Mike, let's get out of here. And he's kind of like, I said, no, the idea is we're going to do it now, so we don't have to go run for our lives. I think I figured it out. And he says, oh, good. So then we hiked up to the top. And it wasn't far. It was like 100 yards, 150 yards maybe. And we were in this big pile of rocks. It was perfect because, the fire would come up and then there was no more place for it to go. And it would go around us and head up this other ridge, but we were on this flat up there. And so we're there for about 20 minutes, and the fire was cranking along, but still. Then all of a sudden, boom, it did it. It just blew, and it went all around us. And the moral of the story is, or the irony of the story, is that the next morning, so first thing I called dispatch, and I said, hey, look, you're probably going to be hearing from somebody that we lost our fire, and it must be close to 1,000 acres now. Just want to let you know that we're in this safe spot and everything's fine. We're just going to hunker here through the night. We'll call you periodically. They said, yeah, we're kind of wondering. And I said, yeah, so that's the situation. I go, okay, great. So we're kind of hunkering there, and we eventually fall asleep. And next morning I get up at about 5, and I think that we had slept from 2 to 5, something like that. And then about 6, I start hearing the groaning of an airplane coming. And it's a single engine. And it's the forest fire management officer. So she's flying, and she's checking all her fires on her district. And she comes to this fire, and she's circling, and it's a ridge over. And so she just goes, I think, I'm trying to remember who it was. I think it was Melody, but I can't remember what her name was. But anyhow, we were going by each other's names on the radio, and I said, we're not over there. She goes, well, this is the fire I want you guys to jump. And I said, well, we didn't jump that one. We jumped this one. We didn't even see that one. And she says, well, it's not doing much. So she came over to our fire, and she just goes, yeah, I didn't even want anybody on this. I wanted just to keep burning. So, and that happens a lot when you have a lot of fires close to each other. You're sitting there trying to pick around, and like I said earlier, it was starting to get darker, so we wanted to get on the ground and start doing something. And the other fire wasn't putting up any smoke at the time. It just, for some reason, laid down. Mm-hmm. So we never even saw it. This was the only thing we saw in the area. So that's why I put the people on it. And I explained that to her. And she just kind of goes, well, no big deal. We'll send a helicopter come in and get you guys. There's no reason for you to be hanging out on that ridge any longer. But back to my point where I went off on that story was I had 20 years under my belt and a lot of experience. And it still doesn't mean I'm not going to make mistakes. So back to that point of being a good communicator, and also realizing that that was my aha moment where I said, I can never say I've seen everything again, because I will never be able to say that.
Yeah. And
so by the time I got around to 25 years or 30 years, it was like I accepted the fact that there'll always be surprises.
Yeah.
And you just have to pay attention to it.
Excellent example. Wayne, thanks so much for sharing your time and your knowledge with the listeners of the radio show. If somebody wanted to follow up with you, let's just say that they've got questions to ask you, or you said something that was intriguing for them, and they wanted to learn more from you, or maybe they even want to just send you hate mail.
That's fine.
Yeah, like you need some more of that in your inbox. That's what the delete button's for, by the way. How could they get a hold of you?
They can just email's the best.
Okay, and what would that be?
It's just wwilliams
Okay.
at mt.gov.
Okay, wwilliams at mt.gov, and I'll put that email address in the show notes too for anybody that would want to have that.
That's it. Episode 6 is complete. Thank you again to Wayne Williams from the Montana Department of Natural Resources and Conservation for sharing his thoughts on wildland firefighter safety. And thank you for sharing some of your valuable time with me today. I sincerely appreciate your support of my mission. If you like the show, please go to iTunes and search for SA Matters Radio and subscribe to the podcast and leave your feedback and a 5-star review. This will help others find the show. You can also sign up for the free SA Matters monthly newsletter by visiting samatters.com and clicking on the red box on the right side of the homepage. Be safe out there, and may the peace of the Lord and strong situational awareness be with you always.
You've been listening to the Situational Awareness Matters radio show with Dr. Richard B. Gassaway. If you are interested in learning more about situational awareness, human factors, and decision-making under stress, visit samatters.com. If you are interested in booking Dr. Gassaway for an upcoming event, visit his personal website at richgassaway.com.